Hello everybody, welcome to AP Sources Simplified. We're going to continue on with our preparation for the AP test. So today we're going to take a look at the Civil War and the causes of it. So the first thing we want to look at, and this is kind of the base of the causes of the Civil War, is the slavery-based economy, the ideals of the Declaration of Independence, and the Constitution. So the slave-based economy goes back to the beginning of the colonies. The South depended upon it at first for its cash crop of tobacco, and then later on for cotton. And the North profited off of it in a variety of ways, via money lenders to those large plantations, the shipping that the cotton and tobacco provided, and the manufacturers later on, when we go through the market revolution, will be able to turn that cotton into clothes. In the Declaration of Independence, you have high-minded ideals of life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and equality. And those were definitely at odds with slavery. So it was kind of hard to square that circle there with how do you, as a founding of this country, have those ideals, but at the same time have this brutal system of slavery. And then we get the Constitution. And in the Constitution, there's a couple of spots. While it doesn't specifically say slaves, they usually have other words for it, like indentured servants or labor. The meaning is slavery. So the first one is the 3/5 compromise, which the South wanted because they wanted to be able to count their slaves in order to have a higher population amount, which would give them greater representation in the House of Representatives. So they said every slave is worth 3/5 of a person. And there also is in the Constitution a fugitive slave clause, basically saying that, slaves that escape need to be brought back. Now, again, they don't actually say slave, they say person held to service or labor, but it means slave. Okay, next thing we want to look at is the slave trade and the 1820 Missouri Compromise. The 1808 international slave trade was banned, and the South actually agreed with it. Now, the thing was, though, is the domestic slave trade was thriving, especially since the invention of the cotton gin in the late 1700s. There was a thought that slavery might die out. In the North, many states in the 1780s and 1790s had actually banned slavery, partly because it was just not a viable means of an economic system in that part. And in the South, they thought the same thing might happen until the cotton gin came around, and it made the production of cotton much more viable. And what they needed for the cotton gin was people to pick the cotton, because then they'd bring it to the gin, and the gin would be able to separate the cotton seed from the cotton boil quickly. But you needed a lot of hands out there to pick the actual cotton. And then we have the 1820 Missouri Compromise. The United States had gained some territory in the Louisiana Purchase, and now as that territory became settled, some of these territories started to apply for statehood. And we had a question about, well, these new territories, what are we going to do with them? Are they going to be slave or free? And this will be a continuing question now all the way up to the Civil War. Every time that a territory is about to become a state, Congress has to deal with this question. So this is the first of several compromises. And one thing they've tried to do is try to keep a balance in Congress. So they're going to allow for Missouri right here to come in as a slave state. Maine up here will come in as a free state. And they set this line that's supposed to answer this question once and for all, but of course it won't. And it's the 3630 parallel, or the southern border of most of Missouri. And they say basically anything below this line will be, any territories become states will become slave. Anything above this line will be free states. They think they have it solved, but it won't be. Now, there are other issues. Slavery is the main cause, but there are some other issues that play a part of this as well. One of the big ones is tariffs. Tariffs are always contentious. They're contentious all the way up until the early 1900s. The more agricultural South did not like them because foreign countries, if we put a tax on their goods and they put a tax on our biggest export, and our biggest export by far was cotton. And so the South did not like tariffs because then other countries would put a tax on their cotton and make it less competitive with other countries' cotton. The North was trying to build a manufacturing base. It needed tariffs to protect industries from competition with foreign manufacturers, mostly Great Britain. We were several decades behind Great Britain in the Industrial Revolution. Their goods were cheaper. In order to try to allow for our industry to be able to go and grow, they needed to tax British goods to make American goods competitive with it. Now let's take a look at the 1828 and 1832 tariffs. These tariffs, one of which was called the Tariff of Abominations, they led to some serious disagreements between specifically South Carolina and the federal government. South Carolina threatened nullification, meaning it wasn't going to follow the rules that this federal law. And nullification was a powerful idea. It came from the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions several decades prior in the John Adams administration. And the idea was that state governments should be able to nullify a federal law it deemed that it was outside of its constitutional bounds, that it was a bad law or tyrannical or whatever. The thing was, though, is nullification had no actual legal standing. It was just a powerful idea. And at the time, President Jackson was not a president to mess with. He got Congress to pass a Force Act, and he threatened to send the military to South Carolina in order to enforce this law and to put down any kind of growing South Carolinian dissension. And South Carolina is going to back down. However, this kind of fuels this ongoing debate about the future of the country. Should it be an agricultural-based country and allow for slavery to continue? Or should it develop a manufacturing base with wage labor, or as they called, free labor? So some more events and compromises. Another big one was a compromise of 1850. After the Mexican-American War, the United States had acquired a lot more territory, all of the Southwest. And California, because of a gold rush, was rapidly, its population was rapidly increasing, and was able to apply for statehood. So California enters part of the compromise as a free state. However, there's this key term here that should be in any kind of essay on the cause of the Civil War, and that is popular sovereignty. So this is this idea promoted at the time by Stephen Douglas, that future states should just be allowed to vote on whether to have slavery or not. Forget about any kind of compromise lines or any of those things. Just let's allow the territories to vote. And this opens the door for the Missouri Compromise to be nullified, because now they're saying, well, if you have a new territory and it's north of that Missouri Compromise line and they vote yes for slavery, I guess that old compromise is now thrown out. And also a part of this, for California entering as a free state, there's a very harsh new Fugitive Slave Act. Now, there were a couple of Fugitive Slave Acts that were already on the books, but this one really kind of threatened the sovereignty of northern states. It made it possible for someone who was helping a slave in the north, they could face some criminal issues as well for themselves. And it kind of made everyone in the north, made a lot of people in the north feel like they are now a part of this part of the slave system. And a lot of them didn't like that. There's also, from the 1820s onward, a growing abolitionist movement. Now, there are several key players in this, but if you're going to write an essay on it, one of the biggest ones you should know and put in there is Frederick Douglass and his abolitionist magazine, The North Star. Another big event, or actually this is more of a book, is Uncle Tom's Cabin. This is written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. And if you live in the North, slavery is something that's really far away, so you probably don't ever even think about it. However, the literacy rate in the North is very high, and this was an incredibly popular book and widely read, and it really brought the depictions of the realities of slavery to the people in the North. They could, read and somewhat understand like how terrible the institution was. And then we have Bleeding Kansas. So Kansas was a state that was north of that Missouri Compromise line, and they were going to vote on slavery. Now, the people in the North felt this vote should never even happen because of the Missouri Compromise and that this should be a free state. So what happens is pro and anti-slave forces from across the United States flood into Bleeding Kansas, and you get some violence breaking out and even some small-scale battles. Then we get Dred Scott and John Brown. Dred Scott, who I made a video upon earlier, you should check it out. It goes in depth about this fascinating case, considered the worst Supreme Court decision of all time. Dred Scott, who was a slave who had been taken into free territories, and then in his master's will had said he should be set free, he had a great case for his freedom and his family's freedom. And throughout several years, he goes through the court process, and eventually he gets to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court rules that Dred Scott has no legal standing, that the case shouldn't even be brought there because he's a slave. And also, the Supreme Court under Chief Justice Taney goes a step further and throws out the Missouri Compromise. And depending on how you read the decision, this looks like it opens up slavery to all of the territories and possibly even the states as well. And this enrages the North, especially abolitionists. Then we get John Brown. John Brown was actually a part of Bleeding Kansas. He had gone there as an anti-slavery person and had taken part in some of those violent actions that are there. Then later on, he organizes with some of his family and former slaves. He organizes a raid on Harper's Ferry. Now, Harper's Ferry is a military weapons depot, and he was trying to get a hold of a bunch of weapons to then go and start a slave uprising in the South. His plan goes awry, though. Shortly after taking Harper's Ferry, the military closes around him and arrests him. And while he's on trial, he gives all these speeches and everything, and they're published in the newspapers. And he's a hero in the North, but a total villain in the South. Then we get to finally the election of Abraham Lincoln. Now, the Republican Party was a fairly new party. It had only run in one major election before. It was made up of former Whigs, abolitionists, the Free Soilers, who wanted to have land in the territories both free from slavery, but also free or nearly free for settlers. And this was a very, very powerful faction in that party, which Lincoln was a part of. Now, Lincoln had promised the South he would not ban slavery in the South. He did want to see the territories be with no slavery, but he tried to assure the South he was not going to ban slavery there. However, there's so many conspiracies in the South that Lincoln was going to take away slavery and take away their slaves. And even some of the conspiracies said that he was going to make white people in the South into slaves. There was a lot of mistrust going on with Lincoln. So he was not even on the ballot in southern states. And we can see here, Lincoln did not take any southern states. We have some of these border states right here going to the Constitutional Union Party with Bell. But then Lincoln swept the North and California and Oregon. And that gave him enough electoral votes because most of the population at this time period is in the North. They have much higher population than the South. Popular vote was more close. Lincoln did not get even half the popular vote. And now in this time period, there was a long time after you were elected before you actually took power. And so in this time period from November to, I can't remember, it was either March or April until Lincoln was going to take power, the South was breaking away. And there's a last-ditch attempt called the Crittenden Compromise in the Senate to try and resolve the differences, and that fails. And the president, who's a lame duck president, President Buchanan, also considered one of the worst presidents of all time, he really does nothing while the South breaks away during his lame duck session and before Lincoln can take power. Thanks for watching. If you want to see more AP review materials for this year's AP test, and also I make the primary source explanation videos as well, subscribe to the channel.